who says, I think you guys should take a look at this, and we do.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions. There's a hand at the back in the middle.
Jeff, I think you said that with the 300 DNA exonerations, in about 30% of those cases, one piece of the problem was a wrongful identification, about a 30% error rate. Now that you've had some time to look at the numbers with the sequential show versus the simultaneous photo shows, are we seeing with the sequential a drop in the error rate more than just anecdotally? And secondly, is Santa Clara County the only county in the state that has a conviction integrity unit? And the question would be to Ms. O'Malley, subsequent to that, if that's the case, why she doesn't have one.
So, all right, so a couple things. So of the 300 DNA exonerations, actually, it's that in 70% of those exonerations, eyewitness eyewitness misidentification was a significant factor. So it's very, very high. The studies, see, first of all, our county, while we're a large county, we have 1.9 million people, in terms of data, since we've been doing sequential lineups, it's not millions of cases or hundreds of thousands of cases, it's a smaller sample. However, there have been studies that look at what happens when you have sequential lineups instead of the traditional method of lineups. And what those continuously show is that you get about the same number of identifications, but you have many fewer misidentifications, so that the accuracy of what you're getting is better. And that's really what we want as prosecutors, is that we want to have a procedure where this identification has a very high accuracy rate. So that's something that the studies have shown, and we've seen that in our own practices. Now, look, in terms of conviction integrity units, different DA's offices handle things differently, but I think that every prosecutor is interested in, or should be interested in, trying to minimize the chance of wrongful convictions. And I think that I just think more and more DAs are elected district attorneys are starting to understand that this is an important issue, and it's not something to just say either we don't make mistakes, which of course is not true, or hey, it's not a big deal, it only happens in a small number of cases. Well, here's the truth. It happens in a very small number of cases, but when it happens, that's a real problem. That's a real problem. And of course, look, as a prosecutor, right, this whole conference, this is about wrongful convictions. In my experience, and I know there's a number of police officers here, we have another problem, which is the guilty person not being found, or the guilty person not being convicted. And that happens, and our system doesn't allow us, if the guilty person's tried and acquitted, we don't get to try them again. And so I think for a lot of us as DAs, it kind of bugs us that, wow, why are they focusing so much on the wrongful convictions? There's these guilty people that are going free. And my response about that is, the fact that there are guilty people going free doesn't mean that I shouldn't be trying to fix and mitigate the chance of an innocent person being convicted. So they're not exclusive.
So I do have a process in place, and I have a team of 8 people who participate in evaluations when we are notified or someone asks us to take a look or it comes to our attention. It's either internally or in any other way. And I do have a public integrity unit. And we do look at cases. I agree with what Jeff just said, and I'm a very big proponent of testing DNA evidence, and particularly in sexual assault cases. It's one of the issues that I work on at a statewide level. We have legislation pending right now that would move forensic sexual assault examination kits to crime labs to test for DNA profiles, also working on it at the national level. And I think that it has testing and identifying DNA profiles has exonerated individuals who were either accused of or thought to be the perpetrator of a sexual assault or other crimes, but they're actually identifying a lot more than they're exonerating through DNA. And so to Jeff's point of not feeling defensive that we're doing all this, I think that every prosecutor, and maybe with just by human nature some very, very rare occasion, but every prosecutor is acting with integrity and with honesty and seeking justice in the courtroom. And nobody wants to have somebody wrongfully convicted. But DNA is a great tool to help us convict people that do commit the crimes and exonerate people that don't.
Okay, we have time for one last quick question. Right here in front, Todd. And I apologize that we aren't able to get to all of them, and really appreciate the conversation. Right here.
Thank you. With regards to a lineup, a regular lineup or a sequential lineup, is there any effort to have someone in the lineup who may be similar to the person who is the potential perpetrator? And the second part of that question is, if the eyewitness identifies somebody you know for sure in the lineup is not involved, because I'm not clear on how you get the other people, whether you pay people to be in the lineup or if you take somebody from your office. So 2 parts to that question. One, if the person identifies somebody you know is not involved at all, is the eyewitness told that? And the first part is there an effort to have someone who is similar to the potential or the possible perpetrator?
Well, the process really, it's a thoughtful process of who's going to be, if there's a particular suspect, who's going to be a filler. So you don't want them to look completely different and have the suspect stand out. So they're always looking for similar looking individuals. And I think the software for all the booking photos and things like that are kept in a database, and the database knows how to search for similar features and things like that if it's a photo lineup. So I think that the process requires people to look similar enough so that the one suspect doesn't stand out from all the others. And for our process, the witness or the victim is not told you got the right guy or you didn't get the right guy. We go through the process, we end the process, we thank them, get them on their way, and then we deal with it in other ways, either through law enforcement or through the prosecution.
Same for Jeff. Okay, please join me in giving a huge hand for Jeff and Nancy.
Dr. Jennifer Dysart is a leading voice in the scientific community studying eyewitness perception and memory. She's a tenured associate professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She speaks frequently to organizations of judges, police, sheriffs, prosecutors, and defense attorneys about what science can teach us about the best possible practices in eyewitness identification. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Jen Dysart.
Good afternoon. Two blonde Jennifers to address you today. When I first got my PhD, my mother was very, very excited, and she told all of her friends, "Oh, my daughter's a doctor, but not the kind that can help you." And I said, "Mom, that's really not the case. I volunteer my time, and I travel the country, and I try to..." Well, anyway, let me know at the end how I did, and I'll maybe ring up my mom and tell her I might have helped someone today. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take about an hour to go over 30 years of scientific research on eyewitness identification. So I hope you're sitting down. We're going to go through some things fairly quickly, some things. But here are the two goals. In case your beeper, if those exist still, if that goes off and you need to leave, These are the two things that I really want to cover with you today. Number one, why do eyewitnesses make errors? And two, can we prevent those errors from happening? I believe all of us in this room are extremely motivated to make sure that, number two, eyewitness identification errors being prevented can happen. In the United States, you've heard these numbers kind of floated around, but I just wanted to make sure it's on a visual for you. And I also believe my slides have been made available to individuals who are attending the conference. So no need to write like mad, taking all these lovely notes. You can just sit back and relax. So to date, there are 316 DNA exoneration cases. And what we know from the first 250 DNA exoneration cases that were published in a book written by Brandon Garrett, the University of Virginia Law School, that 76% of the first 250 cases had at least one eyewitness who made a mistake and erroneously identified an innocent defendant. What we also know, kind of strange from that data, is these aren't just the single eyewitness identification cases that you might think. And in individuals, I hear it as I travel the country and lecture, I would never take a case that had a single eyewitness. Well, what about 5 eyewitnesses who all identified the same person? Doesn't that make you feel much better about the case? Well, 36% of the mistaken identification cases were those multiple witness cases. 2, 3, 4, 5 eyewitnesses all making the same mistake. So I want you to keep that in mind. The one thing that might be a little different, you may not have heard this before or framed in this way, but I think it's very useful, to think about eyewitness evidence in a really different way. First, I think eyewitness identification can be extremely valuable. I believe it can be very valuable, but there are some conditions that need to be met. First, the evidence needs to be strong to begin with, which is the eyewitness's memory, which we'll talk about in a second. And number 2, the evidence needs to be collected and preserved appropriately or carefully. So in that, I want you to think about eyewitness evidence as just any other form of trace evidence. So memory is a form of trace evidence. You can't collect the witness's memory like you can other forms of trace evidence. And in fact, the eyewitness evidence is up here. So what do law enforcement do? They have to come up with proxies or ways in which they can try to get at as much evidence as they possibly can. The problem, though, is every single time you go in and you try to collect more evidence, you forgot a couple of things, you have a new lead, you need to ask more questions. Every time that happens, you are potentially contaminating the trace evidence. Finally, time is not on your side. This is a kind of evidence that is degrading and changing rapidly, especially if there's media coverage, other witnesses that the witness might know, that they're communicating about their memories. And unfortunately, memories are getting contaminated over time. So I want you to think about, here on out, eyewitness memory is just another form of trace evidence. And if you think about, let's say, a fingerprint. Let's say you really, really, really wanted to use a fingerprint. You got a lift, it turns out it wasn't very good. The quality is terrible. It is what it is. You're not going to be able to use that fingerprint in that case. So you have an eyewitness, and the eyewitness seems good at first, but it turns out there are a lot of inconsistencies with the witness's statement, and even though you really might want to use that eyewitness, you might find that the witness's memory trace is not as strong as you had originally believed. So the role of the eyewitness in this whole process, because they really have the evidence, they have to perceive something, see something, they have to store this information, they have to be able to remember it or retrieve it when appropriate, and finally they need to be able to communicate that information to you. So if you have children as witnesses, they might be fine on the first 3 steps, but the communication might be where things fall apart. Or individuals who speak a different first language than the officer who's interviewing the witness. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to step back a little bit from the best practices. I'll get there, no worries. I'm going to step back a little bit, and we're going to talk about memory and how memory plays a huge role in the accuracy and reliability of eyewitness evidence. I'm also a psychology professor, hence the PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to test you, like kind of a lot. So I really hope you're paying attention, because I'm going to need some quick feedback. Otherwise, I'm going to get the axe, and I'm never going to get to the end, all right, with my hour with you. So the very, very first thing I want you to keep in mind is perception. This is the textbook definition of perception, that your expectations and your life experiences influence the way in which your brain interprets what's going on. All right? So I'm going to show you a couple of images here. I know this is blank. Take a look. And now I want you to tell me what you see here. What's fascinating about this is that individuals who see the face first then say the ambiguous image is a person's face. When I show them then the naked woman, and then I show them the ambiguous image, what they see, what they perceive, is a naked woman. So something that just happened to you moments before influences the way in which your brain interprets whatever's going on. If you've ever watched a documentary about a child who's been abducted, and then the next day you're walking down the street and you see a parent pulling on a 2-year-old who's screaming, going, "Come on, let's go." Do you call the police? An abduction is happening right in front of your eyes. Right? How do you know it's not an emergency? How do you know? So things that just happened to you can influence certainly the way in which your brain interprets or perceives. So memory, this is a crash course in Introduction to Psychology. Memory does not work like a video recorder. And so when individuals say things like, "I can close my eyes and play it back just like it happened yesterday," that's not what's actually happening. Every time someone says that, you're actually reconstructing a memory. So I want you to do something for me, a little task. I want you to think about a very, very important day in your own life. Really important day. Everybody have one? If you can see you in this moment right now, that's not a real memory. Unless you had an out-of-body experience during that time, which I'm certain probably didn't happen. If you can see you, your memory has been contaminated. I'm going to guess there's a photo of this special day. I'm going to guess that there's maybe a video of this special day. And your memory, I hope it's a good memory that you're thinking of, has been contaminated in a positive way. For me, because I'm still married, it's my wedding day, and there's me and my dad, and we're dancing. We both have big smiles on our faces. It turns out that's also the photograph in my office. So I know my memory's been contaminated, and that's fine because there are no negative consequences for anyone, because I'm still married. All right. So what I want you to keep in mind is that anything that happens after the original event can contaminate a person's memory for the original event. And what you're tapping into at the end of the day might be part of the original event, but also, in all good likelihood, something that's happened afterward. And you heard this morning from Jennifer Thompson, who talked about seeing Ronald Cotton's face. Absolutely seeing Ronald Cotton's face. If that was my student and one of those phones went off, no, I'm just kidding. I'd kick you out right now, actually. So in her mind, she sees Ronald Cotton's face. That's impossible from the original event because he wasn't there. So her memory has been contaminated, first probably with the composite sketch, which I have and I'm going to show you, and then also with the photo array and subsequently live lineup. So face memory works actually in a slightly different way than other types of memory, like studying, rote kind of learning. In fact, it works holistically. So when you see a person, you actually are processing their whole face, not just the individual components of the eyes and the ears and the chin and the nose, which is going to be relevant when we talk about composite sketches. But for now, I just want you to tell me, who is that person? Julia Roberts, excellent. Anything unusual besides the fact that her face was upside down? All right, so this is the picture I showed you. In fact, her eyes are upside down and her mouth is upside down. But your brain is so good at processing faces that when I show it upside down again, you still have difficulty seeing the mouth. Here, I'll help you out a little so you don't have to turn your head. You still have difficulty seeing that the mouth and the eyes are upside down because of the way in which your brain is so used to processing faces. Your brain's not looking at the individual features when you see her face. So the stages of memory, the 3 parts where eyewitnesses can be led to make a mistake or just by virtue of their experience be erroneous, are the 3 following areas. First, the encoding, the acquisition. This is at the very beginning. This is the crime and all of the factors related to the event. Second is the storage. How much time has passed between the event and when the information or the memory needs to be retrieved or recalled. So what I'd like you to do is take a look at this slide. I could spend a very, very long time on it, and I promise that I won't. But you know, if I held up a penny, which none of you could see because you're so far away, and asked you, what is this? Let's call it a penny show up. Most people would get it right, I hope, and say, well, that, of course, that's a penny. When I make the test a little bit more difficult, a little bit more challenging, this is what we end up with. So if I were to say to you, did you get a good look at the penny? Do you think you'd be able to recognize the penny if you saw the penny again? If you've ever asked yourself, right, or asked a witness that question, this is where this becomes relevant. So unless there are some coin collectors probably in the room, unless you're really, really in love with the penny, you probably didn't look at this and have one answer jump out at you. Probably what you did, I'm gonna speculate based on my years of experience showing this slide, is that you did the following things. Number one, nah, something's missing. I don't know. You know what? That whole top row, gotta go, something missing. Can't tell you exactly what, but it doesn't feel right. 10, 11, and 12 facing in the opposite direction. What are the chances? You're trying to trick me here? Right, that's only 3 out of the 12. You know what, those are gone too. Number 5 or 7, the 1 cent. That 1 cent is so familiar, but is the 1 cent or the tattoo on the left side of the neck or the right side of the neck? Is the 1 cent on that side of the penny or the other side of the penny? There's something so familiar. And what happens is most people end up narrowing down their choices to either number 5 or number 7. Anyone want to get a prize for the right answer? Everyone's familiar with the penny, right? Right. This goes to something else that's very, very important. And I'm not surprised, because why would I show you this? Why would I bring you all the way down to the police station to show you this lineup of pennies if I didn't have a suspect? So you believe that the correct answer must be there. Because isn't that the point? I bring you in for an identification. Why would I try to trip you up and actually not have the right answer? So the correct answer is none of the above. And what this does is it demonstrates what we refer to as relative judgment. Relative, or in comparison to all the others. You know, you got rid of a bunch, but in comparison, something or 1, maybe 2 popped out at you as probably the best choices. This is not a good decision when the real answer is not there. When the correct answer is not there, we don't want people narrowing down and picking the best one. We want witnesses and people to make decisions based on recognition. I recognize that penny. So we'll talk about that in a few more minutes. So why do eyewitnesses make errors? We classified the field into 2 broad categories since the late 1970s, so it's been some time. The first is estimator variables, and those are all of the things that are not under the control of the criminal justice system. These are, I'll show you a huge list, but was a weapon used during the commission of a crime? Was a witness really, really afraid, stressed? Those things influence accuracy. And second, we'll talk about system variables, procedures, choices that law enforcement make when collecting the evidence and preserving the evidence. So here is a not exhaustive, hence et cetera, at the bottom list of factors that influence the reliability of eyewitness identification accuracy. I'm going to talk about just 2 of this list. The first is the presence of a weapon. When perpetrators use a weapon during the commission of a crime, guess where witnesses look? At the weapon. And when they're looking at the weapon, where are they not looking? At the face. And what happens then, especially in short crimes, when weapons are used, identification accuracy is reduced. By the way, this also works for police officers. I have a former student who was a chief of police at the time. He now has a PhD, did his dissertation on weapon focus with law enforcement. And guess what? They look at the weapon too, right? Turns out everyone's worried about dying or being injured in this process. The other estimator variable that I want to talk about briefly, because it's been mentioned earlier, is cross-race identification. And the science on cross-race identification is very clear. This is a topic we've been studying since the late 1960s, and what we know is that people are more accurate at identifying people from their own racial or ethnic group than they are from people of other racial or ethnic groups. It has nothing to do with prejudice. It has nothing to do with racism. It has to do, quite likely, with the way in which your brain processes faces when they see someone of a different group. A different area of the brain is actually processing that face, which probably has something to do with why we're less accurate later on. So it's an in-group, out-group phenomenon. However you want to divide it, age, race, not gender, very interestingly, we're equal on identifying people of other genders, but this is a very pervasive finding found around the world. What now can we do about all of that? So we know that eyewitnesses bring to the situation limitations based on their opportunity to observe, all of the estimator variables that were listed. But law enforcement can do something in order to try to collect and preserve that evidence as accurately as possible. So here are areas that I'm only going to talk about identification procedures, but here are areas that need attention. 1, 911 dispatcher. That is the person who can be collecting as much evidence as accurately, quickly as possible. In fact, the witness might still be looking at the perpetrator during that interaction with the dispatcher. Crime scene control, witnesses must be separated. This is what the dispatcher should be telling them, not to speak with anyone else until law enforcement arrive. Witness interviews, the cognitive interview. Anyone here trained on the cognitive interview? Get trained on the cognitive interview. Fabulous technique. It essentially uses all of the principles of memory and increases the amount of accurate information that witnesses give by about 35%. The general principle is that witnesses shouldn't be interrupted. So it's very hard for married people to do it. I'm just kidding. Witnesses shouldn't be interrupted. Just let them just think, let them talk. So when they start to say things like, let's say two perpetrators, to look for clarification is absolutely the wrong way to go about getting essentially as much information as possible. People can't hear me? Could you not hear me? Oh, no, you're good? Yeah, I can talk louder. I don't really think you need that. All right. And finally, wow, I can hear that now. Finally, eyewitness identification procedures. So here are some of the procedures, and I'm going to focus really on 2, with the exception of making a comment about show-ups as I listened to the comments this morning. So first, mugshot searches. Please don't use them. That's my plea. This is essentially the all-suspect lineup where a witness sits down in front of a book of arrest photographs. Sometimes it's on the computer, and witnesses will look through hundreds and hundreds of photos until they finally see someone who looks like it might be the guy. And then they pick that guy. And if he can't come up with a decent alibi, he's probably going to end up in a live lineup or a photo array. And aren't we going to be surprised when the eyewitness picks him again? So the all-suspect lineup, which are really anyone who's picked could potentially be charged, not recommended. For show-up identifications, I've done a lot of research on show-ups. I understand that show-ups are absolutely going to continue to be used. And here's a great bit of advice. The best advice, actually, that I've probably ever heard about the instructions for show-ups to a witness. This comes from a chief of police in Massachusetts, Chief Bill Brooks, who also is a certified trainer in eyewitness identification. And this is there's a series of instructions that he gives, but I think this is extremely clever. So it goes something like, you're going to be asked to view some people. This is the eyewitness when you're about ready to pull up on a show-up identification procedure. You're going to be asked to view some people. The person you saw may or may not be among the people you are about to view. Now all of a sudden the eyewitness thinks they might be seeing more than one person. In fact, that's not the case. They're going to see one individual in the show-up, but now it reduces, right, their belief that you've caught the one person who's responsible essentially for committing the crime. So a suggestion that's given by law enforcement, which I really like. Then I'm going to talk about sketches, composites, and then finally lineups and photo arrays. The problem with sketches and composites is, as I stated earlier, they're inconsistent. The way in which they're created is completely inconsistent with how your brain processes faces. So when the eyewitness is asked to sit down and pick out the nose, and pick out the eyes, and pick out all of these other features, it's essentially like Mr. Potato Head, right? You're going to pick out which shape, and then you're going to add some eyes on there, and you're like, nah, not those ones. I think I'll put on some other ones, see how that looks, see how I feel about it. But this process is really, really difficult for witnesses to do because we process faces as a whole and not by individual features. So Jennifer Thompson and I presented last week in Connecticut, in Hartford, and we didn't have these slides, and so I promised I would bring them this time. So in the center of this slide is the composite sketch that Jennifer Thompson created in her case. You guys don't know which one is Bobby Poole and which one is Ronald Cotton. So I'll let you take a look. And I think probably what you'll see is, either way, not a bad sketch. It looks similar enough to both of these individuals. This also goes to the point that Jennifer said earlier when she said white people look at these two photos and say, oh my goodness, they look so much alike. And African Americans go, are you kidding? They don't look anything alike. Right? So I wanted you to see these. Bobby Poole, who the composite sketch really is of, is on the right. And Ronald Cotton is on the left. So just so you have that mental image. When I woke up this morning in the hotel, I turned on the TV and looked at the news, and I found this. So this is a local case, Greenbelt Trail in Concord, California. There was this composite sketch. Now, if you just looked at the sketch really quickly, you probably wouldn't have guessed that the perpetrator is supposed to be Latino or Asian, because those are almost identically, like those are almost the same. Early to late teens, 5, 6, it's a child, right, and short black hair. And the question is, does this composite sketch help solve the crime? What does it do? Well, what we know now from research on composite sketches is that this process of sitting down with someone and creating the sketch, working on the composite, what it actually does is affects the memory and how the memory for the actual perpetrator is stored. So now what happens when the individual thinks of the perpetrator, the best image, the most recent, the one they saw the longest, is the composite sketch. So the composite sketch now becomes the new memory of what the perpetrator actually looked like. And when calls come in, when people say, yeah, that looks like my neighbor's kid, I always thought he was good, he mows my lawn. But I think that's my neighbor's kid. Now all of a sudden, will we be surprised if the neighbor's kid got picked up because he looks like the sketch? Are we going to be surprised if the eyewitness picks him? The whole reason why he was selected was essentially because he resembled the sketch. So he's probably going to look the most like the sketch, bless you, in the identification procedure. So we shouldn't be surprised. Should we be surprised at trial when the jury is shown the composite sketch and the defendant and how similar they are? No, that's how we found the defendant, because he was similar to the composite sketch. But the question is, how good is that composite sketch? What test are you giving to eyewitnesses to determine whether or not the composite sketch they created was accurate and good? You ask them, hey, what do you think? Does this look good? And they go, it's not 100%, but it's pretty close. Did you know that composite sketches in all the DNA exoneration cases in this country, if you think about how often composite sketches are used in your cases regularly, how often? Not often at all, right? 25% of all DNA exoneration cases had composite sketches. 25%. The next thing after that is false confessions and then eyewitness misidentification. So the composite sketches are an extremely important part of this problem when innocent people get picked up based on a likeness to who knows what. That's the problem with composite sketches. All right, enough about that. We're going to talk about lineups for the rest of my time with you. What's the purpose of a lineup? I'm actually going to wait for an answer on this one, so no worries. What's the purpose, and I'll repeat it so that it gets picked up. What's the purpose of a lineup? Yes? A photo array or lineup? Sure, let's go photo array. But you've been doing this a long time, so we're going to think quickly on your feet and photo array.
Let's say it's multidimensional. You can see the person walking. You can make the person talk, as well as see profiles, facials, mannerisms, things like that.
Okay, and what's the purpose then? Why would you do that? Excellent. It's a memory test, right? For the eyewitness. The lineup or photo array, I'll use those terms interchangeably, it's a memory test. The witness has information up here, and you're essentially trying to tap into that information. So the type of retrieval that you're going to use is recognition. You've used recall lots. You've asked them for a description. They've talked about the hair and various other things, the height, the weight, and now you're going to use recognition as a test to see if the witness picks out who you think is actually the perpetrator. It is not a reasoning task. It's a recognition task. So if you think back for a moment to the pennies, and you think about which one, could it be this one, could it be that one, that should have been your first clue to abandon the process. When you don't quickly recognize an individual, that should be one of your first clues, that the eyewitness's memory is not strong. When you see someone walking down the street that you recognize, that you know, how long does that take, that process? Like a split second, maybe, right? Otherwise, wouldn't social interactions be really awkward, right? Takes like a minute, and you're like, oh, hi, how are you? My goodness, right? When you see someone that you know, that process happens very quickly. And every once in a while, we're wrong. I was walking down the street in Manhattan yesterday, and I went, hi, to someone who had no idea who I was, thought it was a student. And so we all make this mistake, right? When we see people that we think we recognize. But quick identifications are much more likely to be accurate than these long, deliberative processes. Because it doesn't take 30 seconds, 45 seconds for you to tell that this is a person that I've seen before, that I recognize this individual. So anytime you have witnesses that are taking a couple of minutes to make their ID, you should really, really take that into consideration in terms of the likelihood that this is accurate. And please do not say to a witness, take your time. Don't leave a witness in the room with a cup of coffee or glass of water and come back 5 minutes later and find out what their decision is. You've lost that really valuable information about how quickly the eyewitness did make the identification. So if you're doing sequential identification procedures on a computer where the witness can go through, right, you absolutely, absolutely shouldn't be telling them, like, take as long as you need. Don't tell them, hey, quick IDs are going to be looked at as being more accurate, so be as quick as possible. Don't say anything. Just don't say anything about the speed. They'll have no expectations about how long they should take. So it was mentioned earlier today, and just to kind of put it up here, and because you'll also have the materials printed for you, the traditional simultaneous array, or the six-pack, is essentially a multiple choice question. You've got your 6 answers there and the multiple choice. And what I instruct my students to do on their final exam is pick the answer that's the best one relative to, like, I actually encourage relative judgment, right, on the exam. And I tell them, if you don't know, guess, because no one's going to prison, right? You might be wrong on that answer, but nothing bad is going to happen. So we encourage guessing in these circumstances on exams, but certainly not here. So I want to show you what this looks like based on information and photos from a real case. And you'll essentially see that this is the problem. Someone in the array or in the live lineup is going to be the best, always. There's always going to be someone who's the best. The question for the eyewitness is that one good enough? Is that close enough to my memory that I'm going to say yes? Also take into consideration, we have all of the social factors, like why did they bring me here? They must have someone, right? All of these things play into whether or not the eyewitness gives you a positive identification. So here are some photographs from an actual case, and a colleague of mine did some research using the materials. There's a video, a surveillance. This is a murder in a liquor store. And what they did is they took the video, which clearly shows the perpetrator, and they showed it to a group of individuals. And then they showed them this photo array, which was used in the case. And we're just going to assume here for a second that number 3, who was the suspect, is actually the perpetrator. That's the guilty guy. And when shown this photo array, after viewing the video, 54% of witnesses picked him. So even though he's the right answer and he's there, there's still a few other people who actually individuals believe to be better matches. That's not the interesting part. Here's the interesting part. What if I took out his photograph? Not exactly like that, but I want to get a second group of individuals. I'm going to show them the video, and I want to see what happens to their responses. Do you expect that this 54% will go down? You can't see my arrow. Oh, maybe you can over here. Will go down to now 21%. Like, do you really believe that the rejection rate will be 75% on this array? Or do you think the choices are going to move somewhere else? They're going to move somewhere else. Very specifically, where are they going? Number 4. They're going to number 4. Why? Because he's the next best one. In fact, 13% of people picked number 4 when the right answer was there. And that's exactly what happens with this second group. Now, 38% of people, when the right answer is gone, 38% of people end up picking the next best option. And what's interesting is that the rejection, it went from 21 to 32. So only 11% of those 54% of people said, you know what, I just don't think anyone here is good enough. So this is what relative judgment looks like. When the right answer is not there, just the next best one is going to get picked. So there's a little game I like to play with my friends when I have them over. Makes me extremely popular. Just really quick. Quick, anyone who's the suspect? Excellent. Were you a witness to the crime? What always surprises me is, I got this was a suppression hearing. The judge did not suppress this identification as being unnecessarily suggestive, which is interesting because I've shown it to probably maybe 7,000 or 8,000 people, and everyone picks number 5. So how could all of these people who have no memory of the crime, no information, no evidence, get it right? Because this isn't a memory test. This is a can I figure it out test. But you can go too far. This is a habeas case that I worked on in Connecticut. And the recommendation for law enforcement is that you should pick fillers based on the witness's description. So when the witness says the perpetrator had a mask on, you should not take a black marker and draw masks on all the individuals in the array. This is a homicide case. It was a positive identification after 29 minutes. Non-blind identification procedure. He was convicted and his conviction was upheld. Is he guilty? I have no idea. But I know this is not good eyewitness evidence. So, researchers in the late 70s, early 80s had identified, a very long time ago, this problem with the relative judgment, the one standing out or hard to find fillers or the backgrounds are a little bit different. What do? They did a lot of research, and what they came up with was, hey, let's show them one at a time. It'll be harder to compare. That's it. There are a few other small rules that go along with that, but essentially that's the sequential lineup. So the individuals in the lineup or in the photo array are presented one at a time. The witness makes a positive identification decision. Yes, no, I don't know, geez, this is really hard, whatever they're going to say, before moving on to the next one. And then they don't know how many people they're going to see. And all these recommendations come from research. Why do you think we have that last one, that they don't know how many they're going to see? Where does that come from? Any guesses? Yes. Absolutely. You say, hey, I got 6 pictures to show you, let's go. And they're at number 5 and they don't pick anyone. And guess what? This is their last chance. So they don't know because we've done the studies. We know from the science that if you tell them in advance, you're just going to get more filler picks at the end. That's all you're going to get. So don't do that essentially to the witness. The other recommendation that we have that I kind of throw in here because I want to talk about a field study is double-blind administration and testing. And this has been talked about a lot this morning, so just to be very specific, it's when the person who's conducting the procedure doesn't know who the suspect is. Or in a blinded version, the person who's conducting the procedure can't see who the witness is looking at that moment. So for smaller jurisdictions, what's recommended is something called a folder shuffle method. You heard of this? I see no movement of anyone's head. Oh, one. I see one nodding head. Folder shuffle method. Imagine you're a very small department. Any crime, everyone knows, right? Everyone is involved, right? Or maybe at some level. And what's done for the procedure is you take each of the individual photographs you would use in the array, you take an envelope or a folder, and you tape it in, one in each, and literally in front of the witness, right, or beforehand, depending on the support, whether or not you can actually videotape this, you shuffle them. So you don't know at any time when you hand over the folders to the witness, one at a time, witness opens it, no, that's not the guy. Hands it back. All right, let me look at the other one. That's him. All right, what I want you to do, and without using a numerical scale, I want you to tell me how certain you are in your identification. All right, the procedure requires that I show you everyone in the array, as I stated to you in the instructions. We're going to continue with the next one. Go to the next one, go to the next one. It's number 5. Like that's never happened, right? The witness makes 2 positive identifications, record everything. Without using a numerical scale, tell me how certain you are in your identification. You have blinded yourself at that moment, the officer conducting it, from who the witness is looking at. Perfectly acceptable from the research perspective in doing an alternative to double blind. So you've heard briefly about lots of research that had been done on this, comparing the traditional 6-pack, the simultaneous procedure to the sequential procedure. In fact, there's over 75 published articles, over 10,000 participants that we've run through research laboratories. But we'd never tested real witnesses in real cases. And so in, 2006 perhaps, it's been a long time, the American Judicature Society decided they were going to have a study that compared this. And so I worked with my colleagues Gary Wells and Nancy Stablai, and we finished the report in 2011. It's now a peer-reviewed journal article in Law and Human Behavior. And what we did is compared just that, sequential and simultaneous, all double-blind procedures. So essentially, we got some funding, got some laptop computers, had a software developed specifically for the, we tweaked it a little bit, working with law enforcement to get the exact instructions that they wanted, to collect the data that they wanted as well, working with the district attorneys in the 4 cities to make sure that we also were getting the exact information that they would normally have after an identification, and everything was standardized. The witnesses saw the warnings, the instructions in advance. The actual perpetrator may or may not be here. Please don't feel any pressure to choose anyone, as your investigation will continue even if you don't choose anyone. People's appearances may change. Yeah, we all look different in photographs, right? Every once in a while, so you want to make sure that witnesses know that you can expect maybe some variation when it comes to the photograph. And in the end, after several years, we had of data we could use just shy of 500 participants. And this is what we found. There was no difference in suspect identifications between the 2 procedures. So about 26% of all the cases, there was a positive identification of the suspect. What we did find is a significant difference in the filler identification. So those are the innocent people, right, that you just put in there, those other options to fill it out, fill out the question. We found a significant decrease using sequential, and that's what we would expect. Based on those 75 studies, 10,000 participants, this is essentially the pattern that we were hoping to get. But what I want to point out to you is something important on the next slide. So keep in mind that in this field study, everything was best practices. With the exception, the only comparison was simultaneous and sequential. It was double blind. It was recorded. There were all of these great instructions. People were trained on filler picks, right? How to go about picking fillers, which is very, very important. And here's what we found. In the simultaneous condition, which is what the arrow is pointing to now, 42% of all positive identifications were wrong, at a minimum. These are fillers. It's possible a few suspects may have also been innocent in this whole process, but for now we're just going to put those into suspect identifications. Numbers we heard earlier today were in the range of 30%, I think, if I'm remembering it correctly. What we found...
Photo to choose.
Once we... That's not what I wanted. My circle disappeared. All right. Next circled is the 31%, essentially, of sequential identifications. When the best practices were used in this field study, 31% of all positive identifications were wrong. We shouldn't be like having a parade. Right? There's still work to be done. And so the question is, how is it possible that with the best practices in place in this study, that still 31% of witnesses got it wrong at a minimum? It's because of estimator variables. You're not going to be able to prevent all mistaken identifications. Witnesses bring with them the belief and the hope that they'll be able to make a correct identification. When you ask them, do you think you'd recognize the person if you saw him again? Yes, I would recognize that person. They really believe it. And when it comes to the test, it turns out sometimes it's much more difficult than they thought. So witnesses who believe that the right guy's there, you're doing the identification procedure for some purpose, want to choose. And unfortunately, a lot of those are choosing fillers.
Photo to choose.
My goodness, very excited to show this video. I thought I'd have to hit start or something. All right. What I want to show you very, very quickly is a short video from Brian Williams had a show on TV. I don't know if it's still on anymore. And nonetheless, it was called Rock Center. And they did a documentary essentially as part of that on eyewitness identification. And they went to Dallas and interviewed some folks in Dallas about the new identification procedures they were using, sequential double blind. And they're also videotaping. And so I have taken a portion of that that I want to share with you because I think for anyone who's perhaps concerned about sequential or double blind, I think it's a kind of really important and impactful video. And now for the third time, you're going to hear that intro.
Photo to choose.
Once we figured out what the science was telling us, we built our practice around the science.
This is the new way lineups are done by the Dallas PD, one of the few departments in the country to videotape the process. This woman is trying to pick out a suspect in a homicide case.
I'm a photo lineup administrator, and my job is to show photo lineups.
Lineups are now administered by an officer who knows nothing about the case and who doesn't know which photo is the suspect.
No.
Also new, the officer explains the suspect may not be in the lineup at all and that the investigation will proceed whether or not there's an ID.
You can pick it up. You can see.
And as you can see, the photos are now shown one at a time. But could you see departments someday following?
So that's what quick identifications look like. And it also talks to the importance of videotaping. Could you imagine this administrator going into court and trying to remember and recreate, well, she was really, I don't know, maybe she won't describe it correctly. I mean, I think this is very, very powerful. And imagine, the eyewitness maybe there was some glare, who knows, but the lights in the room, the eyewitness is kind of leaning in a lot, and she goes, it's okay, you can pick it up. Can you imagine if it was a non-blind administration and that had been the suspect? It would have been gone. Now, that person doing the procedure has no idea if that's the suspect or not. So you can actually be friendly and have a conversation and be helpful to the witness because the witness has no idea. Not many things get suppressed in suppression hearings, but that may have been one of them, right? Oh, you can pick it up. To the suspect? People ask me if she ID'd the suspect. I have no idea. So I don't know if that was a filler identification actually or a suspect identification. But that quick identification, you're going to get it if a witness really does believe they recognize someone. All right. One other really important thing we need to talk about in our last kind of few minutes here is eyewitness confidence. And the reason why this is so important is because jurors believe confident witnesses, period. There's a really fabulous study that Elizabeth Loftus did many years ago, a famous memory researcher, and she had 3 scenarios. And she had 3 groups of individuals who were acting as jurors. In one scenario, they got some information about the case, and there was no eyewitness identification. 18% of people voted to convict based on the evidence they were given. In the second group, they were told about a confident eyewitness. In addition to the other information, 70% of people said that they would convict on that basis. On the third group, there was a confident eyewitness, but it was learned that that witness is actually legally blind without her glasses, and she was not wearing her glasses at the time of the crime. So the legally blind, confident eyewitness had a conviction rate of 68%. So you would expect it's obviously to be somewhat lower, and that's really kind of a scary finding. And so we know that eyewitnesses who are confident, people can put aside all of those estimator variables if the witness really believes it's true. So why is confidence and accuracy not a great relationship? Why can you not rely on confidence in trying to determine whether an eyewitness was reliable? The following reason. Have you ever made a decision in your life that at the time you felt pretty good about it, and today, not so much? Anyone? Right. So it turns out accuracy for the eyewitness is fixed. It was a correct identification decision, or it was incorrect. But your feeling about that decision can change when you learn there's another eyewitness, when you learn that the person confessed, right? When you learn that their fingerprints were a match, you just feel so much better about all this other evidence. You feel much more confident. But confidence at the time of the identification turns out to be the only thing that really is informative or helpful. So all this information that happens after, right, all this contamination that happens to the witness's memory is certainly going to influence confidence. But what does that ultimately tell us? What percentage of witnesses who testify at trials are 100% confident in their identification? 100%, pretty much, right? It's pretty rare to have an eyewitness who testifies at trial who says, yeah, I'm about 80%. It happens every once in a while, but most witnesses are absolutely confident. So how can you use confidence to help us figure out who's right and who's wrong? Right? It ultimately can't be helpful for that purpose. So the reason why confidence is not particularly related is because variables influence our confidence that are not related to accuracy. I want to show you very briefly, no, I'm not, there I am. I'm going to show you what this looks like. At the end of the day, what we rely on, you probably rely on, is the United States Supreme Court decision Manson v. Braithwaite, 1977. That when you're looking at the reliability of eyewitness evidence, it essentially tells you you have a 2-pronged test. This is coming from a psychologist, so I hope I get this right. You have a 2-pronged test. 1, if it was unnecessarily suggestive, right? We're going to go to prong 2 to determine whether or not it's nevertheless admissible. If it wasn't unnecessarily suggestive, the procedure, it's coming in, right, to the jury. So let's say we passed, if you will, hurdle 1, it was unnecessarily suggestive, and now what are we going to do? We're going to ask the witness questions about their certainty. Did they get a good view? Were they paying attention, right? All of these things are what the United States Supreme Court says you should be asking to help you, judge, determine whether or not the eyewitness was likely reliable. So eyewitness researchers have looked very, very carefully at this for a long time to look at when things are really suggestive, does that have an impact on someone's responses to these kinds of questions? Right? So does one thing necessarily contaminate the other? So I'm going to show you some data from one of the original studies that essentially did something that I think many people here would say, that wasn't terrible. The eyewitness, after making an identification decision, is told, good job. Just like Jennifer Thompson was told after she picked Ronald Cotton's photograph, good job. That's the guy we thought it was. So, this first group, the control group, are individuals who weren't told anything at all about their identification. So people view a video, they make an identification, and they're asked some questions about their certainty, their view, various other things. This is what they look like. Pretty low certainty, terrible view, the face isn't very clear, it wasn't easy, and their memory really wasn't their basis for their identification decision. Those witnesses who get the pat on the back, good job, thank you so much, you've been really helpful, appreciate your time, thanks for coming in, they look like this. 50% now, absolutely certain. Great view, 25%. The face is really clear on their memory. It was easy. What an easy decision. The only difference between these two groups of people is good job. This is another reason why double-blind administration is recommended. When this scenario is run with a double-blind administrator, and that double-blind administrator says, thank you very much, you obviously can't say good job, they don't know what the correct answer is, but when they say something nice like, thank you so much for coming in, we'll be in touch, someone will follow up with you, okay, great, wonderful. The witness interprets that as friendly person. When the same words are spoken from a non-blind administrator, so the detective or whoever they've been working with, when they say, well, you've been really helpful, thanks so much, we'll be in touch, the witnesses interpret that as, I got him. That's what we know. And so double-blind administration will protect from this. So I'm going to go back 2 slides because somehow that got mixed up. Here are the recommendations. Here are the best practice recommendations. Double-blind administration, the sequential presentation, and if a witness at the end of the whole process says something like, can I go back and see number 4? What do? Well, the real question you should be asking yourself is, if they recognize number 4, why didn't they pick number 4 the first time? Essentially what they've done is gone through the process, earmarked, if you will, the best one of all of those options, kind of mentally set it aside, got to the end and went, okay, well, it must be number 4 then. And here's the recommendation. If a witness requests another viewing of the sequential procedure, let them do it, 1 time. That'll just be part of the evidence, and it'll be part of the case, and it'll need to be explained at some point why the witness didn't recognize the person the first time around, and that is what it is. But never should it be suggested to a witness, want to see those again? Like, one more try, right? So never should it be suggested to the witness, and they should not know in advance that they're going to have this option, right? That they can go through it again. Fillers should be picked by match to description. So whatever the witness describes the perpetrator having looked like, worn, whatever, all of the fillers should match on those things. And it's much more difficult for live identification procedures than it is for photo arrays. Photo arrays are much easier to handle. In addition, if the suspect in the case is a drug addict and has been in the holding cell overnight, and as long as you can find 5 other people who are going to have the same withdrawal symptoms as the suspect in the case, there are other reasons why live lineups, you should be very, very cautious about using them. So any behavior, any mental illness on the part of the suspect that might make them stand out from the other individuals is something to be concerned about. And you can't just take a photo of that, right? That whole process absolutely needs to be videotaped. The witness has to be given the instructions in advance, get a confidence statement from the witness immediately after that identification. If it's person number 3 in the sequential lineup and there are 3 more people to view, you get the confidence at the time when they say it's number 3, and then move on to the other photos. The suspect can only be presented in one procedure. One procedure. The contamination, and we heard this morning, multiple identification attempts from the witness. Well, of course, Jennifer Thompson was going to pick Ronald Cotton from the live lineup. She'd already seen his picture and picked him once before. No one should be surprised that she's going to pick him again from the live identification procedure. And so that contamination of the memory is very, very important to take into consideration. And finally, video recording and audio recording everything. My last comment and slide, we cannot completely eliminate all mistaken identifications. with our best practices and best procedures. And I hope that's not a sad note, but a way in which we can look at identifications, hopefully work together, do more research, collect more data to find out what's going on more with the estimator variables. Researchers have given everything we can in terms of the procedures. Right? There's no other procedure waiting in the wings that we've been doing research on for 20, 30 years that we're ready to propose. What you have is what we have. And so now more information needs to be gathered on the front end, on the